my mom came to Grass Valley, California in '76. Definitely fresh off the boat. And, back in the late '70s, even into the '80s, arranged marriage was still a pretty prominent thing in Indian culture.
Mm.
And so my dad had already been in the US for a couple years, and was already working and somewhat successful. He had a pretty big real estate business,
Mm.
owned a couple Dairy Queens. And so lo and behold, my mom comes over in '76. My brother was born in '78. But along that, couple year path, my dad started deviating in terms
Mm.
of getting heavily involved in drugs and partying
Mm.
and drinking. And it was really, in March of '81, I was 3 weeks old. I was preemie,
Mhm.
and my mom decided to separate from my dad because it got to a place where
Wow.
things were just going completely south in terms
Yeah.
of, losing properties,
Mm.
losing business. And I'm sure that there was some other stuff that my mom really shielded me from
Mhm.
and probably still does to this
Still
day.
then, yeah,
Just
you'll never
because,
know all the details. Yeah, she
yeah,
probably
and,
wants you to keep a certain image of your father.
yeah, I think to an extent, but
Yeah.
I think she wants to keep a certain image of like protection still. It's that
Mm.
motherly instinct that, you know, does my son, even though he's 40 years old, need to know that, my dad did X, Y, and Z?
Mhm.
Or is it water under the bridge? And my mom did a good job of doing her best to shield us from as much as possible growing
Yeah.
up. So again, it's '81. My mom separates from my dad. I'm 3 weeks old.
Hmm.
Obviously, she's literally, for all intents and purposes, 3 years off the boat, right?
Wow. And
So
did y'all have any family here? Is she here by herself at that point, or
So,
like?
pretty isolated in Northern California. So she had a brother that lived in La Crosse, Wisconsin, and
Mm.
then another brother that lived in DC at the
Wow, so
time.
completely spread out.
Yeah, and I think the thing that was interesting is, in Indian culture, you don't marriage is marriage. It
Mhm.
wasn't, culturally, it's not like the US where you can get married and you can get divorced 6 months later and no one looks at you like
At all.
it's a big deal. It's
Mhm.
like you got divorced. That might happen 2 or 3 more times in your life, right? Like, no one
Yeah.
thinks about it. But in Indian culture, it's very shameful and it's, looked down upon,
Mm.
especially when a marriage was arranged. And so I think there was a moment where my mom, was pretty isolated. I think that there may not have been as much support at the time,
Mhm.
right? And I think later down the road, she was getting some help from family. But I think at the time, there's this whole concept of like, what are you doing? This is wrong. You need to
Mm.
figure this out. You
Mhm.
need to
You
go
need to
work
make it
it
work.
out.
Yeah.
Like this isn't, how things are done in our
Mhm.
culture. So, luckily we ended up, and, I call them my aunts and uncles, but, somehow we were able to connect with a great group of people,
Yeah.
that to this day I've known them for 40 years.
Wow.
My grandma Miriam and Grandpa Ernie were, my Caucasian grandparents, right? But they were Quakers and they met my mom in the hospital.
Mm.
And from that time on, they always took us in, and
Just became the family that, wasn't
definitely.
near.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I had my Aunt Maggie, my Aunt Dorothy, my Aunt Norma owned a Montessori school, which is where we attended, so all these people kind of, they say it takes a village. And
I
the
mean,
reality is we ended up finding a village that wasn't our village, right?
yeah.
Um, so again, it's '81, we're on welfare at this point,
Mm.
right? Living in low income housing. In fact, I remember crazy memories of like playing in the backyard and climbing over the fence, and there was a SWAT team, literally
What?
going into my neighbor's house because he was having like a hostage showdown after he beat his
Oh
girl. And
my
I
god.
remember my mom coming out and grabbing me off the fence and like
Pulling
running me
you
back
inside.
in. And I thought it was like GI Joe. I was like,
You
this
didn't know
is,
if you're a kid.
yeah, I'm
You're
like
just
a,
like, "Oh, what's
young
happening?"
kid.
Yeah.
So, we're living in Section 8, low income housing in Grass
Mhm.
Valley, and my mom starts taking classes part time, right?
Mm.
Because at the time I couldn't be in daycare. And
Mhm.
mind you, my mom's highly educated. So she had a teaching degree in India and a master's in music,
Oh,
but
wow.
obviously neither of those really
Transferred
translated
over to the US,
when,
yeah.
yeah, like she's obviously fresh with the boat. She can't teach,
Mhm.
and master's in music was on the sitar, which is like, which is obviously a very cool instrument, but it's
Right.
not like
Most
the
Americans
drums.
have no idea. Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
so she starts going back to school part time, taking classes, because obviously I couldn't. She had to watch me during the
You're
day,
right.
And then it was really like 84, I think, is when I actually started going to daycare to my Aunt Norma's Montessori school.
Mhm.
And at that point, she went back to school full time
Yeah.
and she graduated in 87 with an accounting degree.
Mm.
And so from there, you know, she basically got recruited by the Air Force. And so the Air Force had a program for both officers and then also for civilians
Mhm.
based on grades that they were just looking for talent at the time. And mind you, we're talking the 80s. So we're talking when the military in the US was 3 times the size it probably is now in terms of
Mhm.
bases. You know, it was before all the big closures happened,
Right, right,
right?
right.
Which was probably in the 90s.
Mhm.
And so, you know, my mom had this opportunity to take this position and it was in Marquette, Michigan, right?
Wait, so you're literally gonna essentially, this means your whole family is about to, like, move from where you are in Northern California to just Michigan?
Not only Michigan, it's Marquette. So Marquette is like the Upper Peninsula. So it's like where people from Michigan don't go. Like it's like way up in the boondocks. It's colder than Michigan. Like, I mean, so for some kids that grew up in, you know, Grass Valley, Nevada City, which is
Yeah.
like a small woodsy town in Northern California, it's like yin and yang, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's literally night and day. You're probably going there like, "Ma, are we, like, is this, like, temporary?"
Yeah, and so what was interesting is obviously the opportunity was too good for her to pass up. I mean, it
Mhm.
offered stability, it offered a career, it offered an opportunity for long-term growth. And you're talking about, you know, someone that's basically, you know, I wouldn't say rough or bumpy, but she, you know, she's fought through those 7 or 8 years, you know, as
Yeah.
it was bad.
Right, right.
Um, and s- and so she ended up taking the job in Marquette. We moved there. We were there for about 3 years. And it's, you know, it's a depressing it's a depressing city. It's
What is it
gloom.
like? Like, what is there anything happening there?
No, not really, and I think it was like, you know, it would be -15, -20, you know, with wind chills and, you know, again, we're coming from California, and so I was younger at the time, and so we were there for 3 years. You know,
Mhm.
generally speaking, when you're DOD, it's 3-year stints, and then sometimes you can extend, but then you also have the opportunity to kinda apply for transfers. And so from there, we ended up going to Davis, California.
Okay.
And so this is when I was in, you know, fifth or sixth grade, I believe. And I was in Davis till I was in like ninth grade. And this is where I kind of started deviating. You know, my brother, straight A's, you know,
Hmm.
great student, honor roll, skipped a grade,
Yeah.
played 2 sports.
And what are you over there doing?
I always got good grades, but I think there was this level of me that was rebelling a bit, you know.
Mm.
So I started smoking pot at a young age. I started basically just being a shithead,
Yeah.
you know, would be the easiest way to put it now
Yeah.
that I'm looking back on it, right?
What do you think was happening? Were you just like you were fed up with moving, your dad was absent, like what were these
I
things do
think it
you
was
think?
probably deep down a combination of all those things and then also, you know, a level of trying to fit in and assimilate. And I think that sometimes when you get in, it's like you smoke pot and smoke weed and other people that smoke weed, you know, you all become
Yeah, you
this
become
tribe.
this little
Yeah. And
unit. Yeah,
so
you're like, "Oh, you do it? All
I
right,
think
bet."
there's probably some insecurities, you know, that led to some of that stuff. And
Mhm.
you know, again, moving, it's like you're moving to a new place.
Right.
Quick way to meet friends, you know, is finding those different types of
Totally.
groups,
Totally.
right? And so, you know, God bless my mom. She was really smart in the sense that she saw all the trouble I was getting
Mm.
into and understood that one of the best ways to battle that is to not let me get comfortable, right?
Mm.
So when I started getting in a lot of trouble in Davis, she took an assignment in Denver. And
Hmm.
so she basically extracted me from all those
That environment,
people
right.
and was like, boom. And the environment was great. Like home life was fine. You
Mhm.
know, all those things were good. Obviously, we weren't like rich, but she provided for us in a great
Yeah.
way. And so she was smart in the sense that she was like, extract him out of there, right?
Hmm.
So then I went to Denver, and you know, it takes you 6 to 12 months to start
To
getting in
start
trouble
getting,
again.
yeah, because 'cause you're
But I,
trying to find out what's happening, what's in, what to watch out for, what to, like, gravitate towards.
but trust me, I found it, right? Like I was, you know, inept in finding ways to get in trouble,
Yeah.
right? So go through that whole system again. I'm basically going into my senior year of high school. getting in trouble. She's catching me with drugs,
Sheesh.
uh, and so then she took an assignment overseas. And so my senior year, and obviously I was mad at the world about this,
Mhm,
but
mhm.
senior year in high school, I basically moved outside of Tokyo to an Air Force base because my mom decided to take an assignment there.
Wow, and this is in, like, mid-90s, mid-late 90s?
I graduated high school in 99,
Okay,
so it's just like
okay,
98, so
okay.
late 90s. So I end up in outside of, Tokyo at this Air Force base, and now I'm hanging out with a bunch of Air Force kids, which it's a little bit different, right?
Mm,
Because these are kids that have grown up on bases, right?
uh,
And living on a base is a bit different than living on the outside. But
mhm,
obviously, when you're in Japan, Americans are used to certain things that don't necessarily always translate to other
mm,
cultures. And so the base was built and it had those things, right?
mhm,
So I think we had the option to live off base, but it just made more sense for us to live in officer housing on
mhm,
base.
mhm,
So there for my senior year, and then after that, obviously, I went to college in Reno.
yeah.
Again, I wanted to go to college in Colorado where all my friends were going, and my mom was like, "Well, I'm not paying for that because I know what'll happen."
Yeah, I mean, well, college is already expensive, and then, some people, maybe it's just not for them, right?
Yeah, and I think for her, it was just that whole concept of making sure that she did everything in her power to keep me away from, in her eyes, what were bad elements.
Mm,
And it was just as much me as the people around me.
yeah.
I was obviously putting them around myself. So, and then obviously went to college in Reno where I graduated.
Mhm. What'd you end up going to school for?
So I graduated with finance degree and a minor in Japanese.
What'd you wanna do?
I was always had an entrepreneurial spirit. It was always a joke when I was a kid that all my aunts and uncles would say I'd have Bouri Industries one day because I was the kid that was buying Jolly Ranchers in, fifth grade and selling them out of my backpack. Like I was that kid,
Wow.
right?
Yeah.
So I would buy, you know, big packs of gum and sell it by the piece to
Mhm.
kids, for their lunch money, and then I would go and
Yeah.
basically reinvest that in in more gum and candy. The sad thing is that turned into, weed and other shit as I
Yeah,
got
yeah,
older
yeah.
because I was like, "Well, I
I
don't
can
wanna
make
pay to
money out of this,
smoke."
why
Yeah, like,
yeah.
why would I wanna do that? Buy an ounce of Bammer weed for $80, I break it down into eighths, and so, that same entrepreneurial spirit got me in trouble.
Mm,
The interesting thing is when I talked to a lot of my friends in this industry, they were all the same. James Whitner, seems that we all kinda had the same path of, like,
mhm.
towing the line, and now we've actually applied that same hustle and that hustler's mentality
Right.
to
In a
legitimate
legitimate
business.
business. Yeah.
But that hunger and that hustle, I think, is what has, shaped a lot of us into being able to be so successful,
Mhm.
especially in this industry.
Totally. I mean, I definitely believe that. One thing I wanted to ask you and thinking about with this entrepreneurial spirit, at what point did you know that your dad had started businesses and real estate and all of that stuff?
I think my mom always told us about it. I
Mm,
don't think that it was ever like, she never hid things about my dad.
mhm,
There was obviously a level of resentment on my end. He passed a couple years ago. I had the opportunity to go see him. I didn't,
mhm,
but I always knew that he was an entrepreneur.
mm,
He just, went down that wrong path and
yeah,
couldn't get it together,
yeah,
which happens.
yeah,
And you see it all the time with people that are successful that they lose everything because they get hooked on some shit
mhm,
or, they just end up get, getting, becoming alcoholics
right,
and that leads to X, Y, and Z.
yeah.
So, it's tough to see, but like I said, it
It
happens, right?
happens. Yeah, I mean, life, it's never a perfect thing. There's always something happening here or there. Um, Thinking about like you went for finance and school for finance but you ended up working in nightlife, right?
Yeah, so, throughout college, I was bartending at a nightclub, which was probably the best job for a college student, right? Like bartending, earning cash. Obviously, I like to party,
Yeah.
so I got to check all those boxes and work,
Mhm.
which was good. And then, once I graduated, I probably spent about a year. I was just bartending until my mom called me and was like,
What are
"Go
you
get a
doing?
job."
Yeah.
Yeah, like I didn't pay for you to go to school to be a bartender. Like it's time to get serious, right?
Yeah. So
And
she had expectations of, like, where she wanted you to go from a career standpoint?
yeah, I mean, growing up in my household, not getting A's was not an option. So
Mm.
even though I was like partying and doing dumb, I was still getting, 3.6, 3.7 or above.
Jeez.
It just, school in my house was not going to college wasn't an option. Like
Mhm.
these are just things, and I think that that's very like I think especially Indian families, like all my cousins, all my aunts and uncles operate the same
Yeah.
way. Like my grandfather was highly educated, but it's just not an option.
Yeah,
I don't.
if you're not checking that box, like, it's a huge problem. And you're probably not just getting it from her, you're probably getting it from,
Oh,
the
the whole
whole
family.
family.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because I don't know many Indian kids that don't go to school. Like I don't know if you do, but I mean, I like generally speaking, they're either Patels, they're in, hotels and gas stations and restaurants. You've got obviously a lot of engineers,
Mhm.
doctors. I mean, just as a culture, I think that, you know, it's just not, again, it was never an option not to get good grades.
Yeah,
No matter what was happening around us, we got good grades and my
yeah,
mom ensured it.
yeah.
I remember I failed art class because some asshole threw wet clay in the kiln. I had all my projects. I waited for the last minute to fire
Mhm.
and they all exploded. So the guy flunked me basically.
Wow.
Mom grounded me for 6 months. I mean, I couldn't do anything. It was the worst.
What was like wait, so what was grounding for you in your house? Like, what would she do?
I was allowed to go out one night till 8 PM to see my friends. Like,
And this is in high school?
this is in high school. I basically was stuck doing SAT prep work during the day, during my summer, right? She
Wow.
basically set up SAT prep work for me that I had to do, and she would come home and check. I mean, it was brutal.
Dude, that there's no way I could spend high school doing that. That is awful. Would you
Yep.
continue to do the same thing? So you would so it was on your mind that like, "Yo, I'm not messing up at school because I can't deal with this."
Yeah, I think through everything, I still got good grades, even
Yeah,
in college.
yeah.
I think I graduated with a 3.67.
Sheesh. So you're working, you said you for a year after school you were bartending, and then what did you decide to do?
So I got the call to get a real job. And after I got the call, I was like, all right, so I'll apply for a couple jobs. I had a couple friends that worked for an insurance company called the Hartford, which is
Mhm.
one of the big five,
Okay.
from an
Insurance
insurance
company. Okay.
perspective. So I applied for this job as an underwriter, entry level. You're basically reviewing policies that insurance agents submit to make
Hmm.
sure that, the house has a good roof and, there's
Right.
nothing that would cause, massive loss
Mhm.
because we
And
didn't.
put liability on the insurance company.
Exactly. And so interview for the job, get the job offer, I just take it. Didn't matter that I liked it. It was literally like, all right, I got to get a real job. So I'll
Mhm.
get this real job. And so bartending simultaneously on the weekends still because the money was really good.
Yeah.
And then obviously working during the week. They ended up getting to a place, and mind you, I was miserable, right?
What year was this when this was happening? You remember like
So this is probably 05 ish,
okay. Okay.
right around there,
Yeah.
05, 06.
Mhm.
So mind you, I absolutely hate the job, right? So, it's literally like office space.
And you're showing up like suit and tie or
Yeah,
like
like use business casual,
yeah.
but I'm not a business casual type of guy. So, it's definitely out of place. And then I'm like showing up to a cubicle. And when I say this is like office space, the cubicles had numbers so the mailroom could drop your off. Like, you know, it was literally I was living in office space and hated it, right?
Yeah.
You had all these career people that were super square that were just miserable because they were miserable at their jobs, but they had 3 kids and that was a career for them and they
Mhm.
weren't switching. They'd been there for
Nope.
20
Had to pay the
years.
bills and they're looking
Yeah,
at retirement and
and
watching the 401k, the
and
whole
mind you,
9.
I respect that
Mhm.
100%. Like, I think that there's definitely a lot of people that need to jump in and pick a career and they just need to excel at it and crush that career and
Yeah.
you can make a great life doing that, right?
Right.
But just wasn't for me, so I'm showing up and mind you, I wasn't the best underwriter because I really didn't like it. So, it's not like I was embracing this role and
Right.
in my head I was like, I'm gonna move up in this
No,
company
you
and
were
I'm gonna
like,
get into
"I'm only here
sales.
because, like, I'm trying to appease, like, my family."
Yeah, I was like, this sucks. This is terrible. And so they ended up getting to a place where they were shutting that office. This is kind of like right when things, I think the start of the recession, maybe,
Mhm.
right? And they announced that they're, basically shutting the office down and I could move to Oklahoma City, right? And I'm not saying that Reno was awesome. Like, it's a great place, it's close to Tahoe, but it's sure the better than Oklahoma
Oklahoma
City,
City.
right? Like, I don't care how you skin the cat. Like, so I'm not going to Oklahoma City, right? There's no way.
Would you pick Oklahoma City over Michigan, Marquette?
I mean, possibly. It's a bigger city, right? Like, there's got to be more to do than in small Podunk, Marquette, Michigan. But at the end of the day, I'm like, I'm not going to Oklahoma City.
Mhm.
So, nightlife company called Nikki Beach, which is big in Miami and big internationally. Somehow they struck a deal to open some nightlife venues in Reno.
Mhm.
A good buddy of mine, who's actually my business partner in Feature, basically like my brother, he was working there. I ended up applying, took a job as a junior host, no salary,
No
just
salary.
no.
So
So
how you
back in
get
the day,
paid?
you got paid on commission, right? And so the
Uh,
idea was they had 2 or 3 hosts that were salaried, and I kind of applied late, and then they had these junior host options. And, I basically went in and kind of crushed that job. And, within 6 months to a year, I was the manager of the
oh,
VIP
wow.
team, right?
Right.
And so from there, was managing nightlife venues, and then Nikki Beach ended up pulling out because why would some internationally acclaimed
Hmm.
nightlife company want to be in Reno? Like, the
Mhm.
deal fell apart. The hotel ended up running the venue still, so we stayed on, right? They just changed the names,
Yeah.
whatever. And then I just realized, like, I was kind of burnt, so I decided, if I'm gonna do nightlife, Vegas is definitely the place to go.
Mm.
We had a lot of friends that were working in nightlife out here, and so I ended up moving to Vegas, right?
Wow.
So Vegas nightlife is not like Reno nightlife, just to be
So,
clear. Like,
probably an obvious question. What's the difference?
so I guess from a work standpoint, you're out all the time, right? So
Mm.
one, our venues in Reno were open maybe Thursday, Friday, Saturday.
Mhm.
Most venues in Vegas are open 5 days a week or 4 days a week. If it's a company that has multiple venues, you might work in multiple venues. You had office hours where you were in there, contacting and basically reaching out to people if you're in VIP services.
Right.
Then you had outings, right? So on top
Yeah.
of all that, you go as groups to, other venues to
Mhm.
basically support other venues, show presence, try to
Yeah.
acquire tables for
Yeah, of
your
course,
venue.
right.
And, I'm 8 or 10 years into nightlife at this point, and either there's 2 types of people in nightlife. There's people that love to party
Mhm.
and can party for the rest of their lives,
Right.
and they're great at nightlife. And there's guys that are, good at not partying, but it's a career and they can really excel at it because there's
Excel.
tons of money to be
Mhm.
made and they crush it.
Right, they're just locked in on that part of it.
Sure. And I was probably the guy that liked to party initially, but then got burnt out. Was
Mm.
like, at some point you get old,
What
right?
like, what type of hours are we talking here? Like, are you always like, do you sleep? Are you always on? Like, what's happening?
No, I mean, I think, like, you had to be at the venue from, before opening to at least 1:30 or 2 in the morning,
Mhm.
and then you could probably leave. But if you had a big spender or client, you're gonna
You're
stay
gonna
there
stay
till
with them,
4.
right.
You're gonna take them to after hours. You're gonna
Mhm.
take them to the Rhino because
Mhm.
you wanna
Mhm. You wanna
retain
make
that
sure
client,
they
right?
yes, absolutely. Wanna make sure they're
And
having a great time.
so again, I just hit a wall where it just wasn't working.
Mm.
And so interestingly enough, I was having a tough time in Vegas in terms of working at nightlife. My business partner EJ was still working in Reno, and they needed help basically on the weekends
Mhm.
at the venue I used to work at. And so
Mm.
I started flying up every weekend and working there,
Oh, wow.
and basically, running the venue on the weekends and
Mhm.
then flying back to Vegas during the week because I
Hmm.
lived in Vegas or
Yeah.
stay for a couple days. It just depended.
Mhm.
And so that's kind of when, I had this brilliant idea to open Feature.
Hmm. So tell me about this side of life, right? Because this is a whole nother interest, right? Like this is like it's not finance, it's not working in nightlife. Now we're talking about sneakers, we're talking about streetwear. What was like what was that spark of inspiration?
So I think, I've always been into fashion. And when I was working in Reno in nightlife, I basically subleased a space in the back of a store called The Attic,
Hmm.
which was a women's boutique. And this is back when contemporary was the shit, So I'm talking Ed Hardy,
Mhm.
Rockin' Republic,
Mhm.
Salvage. The category that we're in now didn't really exist, right? So
Mhm.
there's luxury, streetwear, was probably emerging at that time, but there was other graphic t-shirt lines, but it was never considered to be streetwear. This concept of like an off-white or, and I hate to use this term Lux Street, right?
Mhm.
But it's not necessarily luxury. It's not necessarily contemporary. It's, a lot of it's graphics driven. It's really expensive. So it's, luxurious. I don't know what the right term is. I don't think anyone has coined it yet,
Yeah.
but that category didn't exist.
Mhm.
So I subleased the space in the back of the store, and I'm basically open up accounts with all these contemporary brands that are hot at the time, the
Mhm.
toughest brands to get. And so I'm doing that on the side, and then lo and behold, that store ends up shutting down. Right?
Mm. They just was it just like weren't getting the traffic, weren't getting the business?
The owner basically decided to open a salon and didn't feel
Uh,
like, boutiques are a struggle. Like anyone
yeah.
that tells you that running a retail operation is easy is delusional. Like
What's the what would you say is that the biggest part? Is it getting traffic in, or is it like landlords and rent, or is it just a combination?
I think it's a combination of everything. I think a lot of boutiques are owned by, I hate to use this term, it's like a lot of women's boutiques are owned by people where it's just a side hobby
Mm.
or they like fashion and, rich husbands looking for them to do something. Like I think it's a tough industry. You got to maintain inventory, you got to have cash flow, and all
Mhm.
those things are things that people don't grasp. And to be honest, I didn't grasp it initially
Yeah.
when I opened this place, and we'll probably get to overbuying at some point in this conversation because I was the king of that for a long time. But so she decides to shut down the store, and I obviously still love fashion.
Yeah, of
So
course.
what I do is I go open a box at UPS and just say I moved my store, because when you have a box at UPS, it's sweet, whatever, but really it's just your box.
Mhm.
So what I do is I basically keep all my wholesale accounts and I start a personal shopping business. And
Mm.
so basically set up a room in my condo, which was downtown in Reno, set it up with all these clothes, and then I
Mhm.
work in nightlife. So I'm working with a bunch of people that are making cash.
Right, so you bring them through.
And so what I would do is either bring them through, or I would set up these bags full of product in their size. I
Wow.
would give it to them, and then I would say, "Look, everything's 30% off retail."
Hmm.
So that was kind of my stick. Like, you don't have to pay retail. You don't go to a store and buy this. I'm going to give you a better
Come to
price,
me, right.
and you don't have to go anywhere. Right? I'll just give you
Mhm.
this bag of clothes. It was, in hindsight, it's almost like the that's happening now. These subscription services,
Right, yeah, yeah.
but in a more ghetto and more ridiculous way, because, I was using these bags and I was like, here, this is all this stuff in your size. Tell me what you end up keeping. You pay me,
Yeah.
get the bag back. It goes to somebody else. Right.
Mhm.
So even when I moved to Vegas, I was still doing that to an extent because I still
Mm.
had inventory,
Mhm.
then I had to liquidate it. So I put some stuff on eBay for the first time and kind of stayed in boutique world, I guess,
Mhm.
throughout. It was really, though, when I got to Vegas that, we'd always had an affinity for sneakers, right?
Yeah.
Like, who doesn't like cool shoes? It's almost like a haircut,
Yeah.
like putting on a fresh new pair of sneakers
You feel amazing.
or
Yeah.
clothes for that matter, right? When you
Yeah.
put on a fresh fit and you're going somewhere, you feel good, right?
100%.
Like it's, you got a little bravado to you. You're
Yeah,
ready to
yeah.
go.
You
Like,
like can't nobody tell you nothing. You just,
yeah,
you feeling yourself.
yeah, you feel like you're dripping, like and so uh at the time there was obviously Undefeated in town,
Mhm.
and they had sneakers, and there wasn't really anyone else.
Yeah.
And so in my head, I'm flying back to Reno on the weekend. I'm talking to my to EJ, and I'm in the DJ booth. He's DJing, and I'm telling him about this idea. And at the time, this is right when housing market crashed, and so
Right. Everything's
EJ,
just
yeah,
falling apart
everyone is, right. So
and
he just
hurting.
basically, like, he had a deal on his house. So he's paying his mortgage into a bank account, but not paying his mortgage because that's how you had to do it in order to get them to basically refi you into something that was
Oh,
reasonable.
wow.
So he was basically making sure he had the money for his payment, but hoping that the bank would basically come back and say, "This is absurd. We got to figure this out,"
Mhm.
right? Because
Mhm.
the guy was in, I think, might have been an all interest loan. Like, he just got a deal at the time, right?
Yeah.
So he's basically like, "Yeah, this sounds like a good idea. I've got some cash that I've been putting away, right? So let's do it." So, at the time, we ended up, there's four of us that started this business. Now
Mhm.
there's three of us, but at the time, Aaron, who's still involved, he was a big DJ in Vegas, and we'd gone out one night, and I was a little drunk, and I told him kind of
Mhm.
what I wanted to do and why, I gave him the elevator pitch,
Yeah.
right? And he's like, "Oh, I've got some money. I'm down," right? And then, there's a fourth guy that actually same scenario. He was a friend of a friend, and he ended up saying the same thing. So lo and behold, we came up with 75 grand, right?
75 grand. Were you nervous at all about working with other people in that way?
You know, I will tell you that we ended up having a horror story with one of the partners, but the other two, he's our COO.
Mhm.
He's still heavily involved. I couldn't have built a business without him, so Aaron's still involved as well. I think it always poses challenges. I would say that we definitely made some mistakes that we shouldn't have. We had an operating agreement, it wasn't solid.
Mm.
That posed challenges down the road. But
Mhm.
I think that it is nice to have somebody that I can lean on and wholeheartedly trust
Yeah.
when building something like this.
I mean, it's a lot to go if you were to go into this by yourself, right? I mean, I'm sure you probably think back to moments where, shit hit the fan and you're like, "Ah, I'm glad I got like some partners in this because it's a lot for
Yeah,
one person."
it's interesting because on the one hand, when you're struggling to make it, you feel like it's not just me, it's not just my money on the line. If we fail, we all fail, right? And then sometimes when you get really successful and somebody's not pulling their weight, you start thinking the opposite. Like, why is this along for the ride?
Mm.
Like I'm working 7 days a week,
Mhm.
90 hours, waking up at 2 in the morning to call Japanese and European brands in the hopes that you can pick them up,
Right.
and that's the type of work ethic I had. And that can become challenging too sometimes,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And so, um, so I pitched these guys, came up with the money. My mom let me borrow some money in order
Mhm.
to start
Yeah.
the business, and we find this location in Chinatown. And mind you, now this is 2010, so this is in the peak of the recession.
Right.
So
In Chinatown in Vegas. Okay.
correct. So you know, obviously we're complete assholes for opening up a retail store in the middle of a recession and thinking that's a good idea.
But
But
the rent must have been.
yeah, the rent wasn't bad.
Yeah.
Like, we're still in that location. We've remodeled it a bunch of times. We still have our original, location, which obviously we all have an emotional connection to because it's where we started.
Mhm.
But we opened this store and we call in every favor we could, right? We call in a friend of a friend that's a contractor, so he helps us, do this basic build, right? And when I say basic, we had IKEA shelves, the thick brown wood ones that everyone buys, right?
Yep.
Like, everyone's used these at some point. IKEA's probably done $1 billion in sales off these shelves.
Literally, I think I had some in my apartment in Boston.
So we have this store that's basically 4 shelves and it's lined. All the walls are lined, and in between the shelves, we like bought mirrors from a mirror place. Not even like they didn't even have a border. They were just cut big mirrors that we basically stuck to the walls, right? And then, mind you, we did everything that was tacky that I would never do in retail. So we carried G-Shock. So G-Shock gave us this big
You
case,
put the
right?
case in
Oh,
there.
yeah. You have
The
Nixon,
logo
you
and
put the Nixon.
everything.
Yeah,
Yep.
you don't care, right? Like, it's like, I mean, we look like zoomies, right? Like, anything free POP display,
You took it.
if we could, we would use it, right?
Mhm.
And so the concept was sneakers and anything you could pair with sneakers. So think plain t-shirts, no graphics. So you
Mhm.
bought a green pair of sneakers, we had a green t-shirt to match, right? Green G-Shock to match if you want to go that route. And that was the original concept. Well, lo and behold, I'm coming from the contemporary world where
Mhm.
brands look at proximity to distribution and that's it. So
Mm.
if you're 5 miles away from the closest account and you're decent, they'll open
They'll
you,
open you.
right?
Right, right.
Because that's all that matters.
Mhm.
Well, we opened up in a place that was far enough from undefeated. And, you know, basically in my head, I'm like, we're going to get all these accounts.
Mm. Had you had any other intel aside from your previous experience that would tell you otherwise?
Not
So you were
really.
pretty like, "This is gonna work," right? Like, you'd already brought in your partners that were also investors. You'd already, got this money from your mom, construction, build out, all of this stuff. And so now you're like, "Yeah, this is the easy part."
Yeah. So now in my head, I'm like, we're going to get these accounts. Right. So, and again, I didn't know a crazy amount about sneakers. We would come to undefeated when we came to Vegas and
Yeah,
we would buy cool shoes.
right.
Right. Didn't fully understand that there's Vans Vault and there's this tier and that tier. And so as we're getting ready to open the store, we find out that a big DJ Vice, is opening a store called Crossover in the Cosmopolitan,
Oh my
right? So now I'm like,
goodness.
right, because now you have undefeated and now you have this store opening in this brand new hotel.
Mhm.
they open up with Tier Zero Nike, they open up
Wow.
with Jordan, they open up with basically all the best sneaker
Mhm.
accounts. We're over here in Chinatown with Clay and Pony and Creative Rec and Pro Keds because no major footwear company would with us. No
What
one.
were they saying?
You know, you just opened, you know, the usual stuff that in
Mhm.
hindsight, once you realize why big footwear companies tell you no, it makes sense. And the reasoning is that most boutiques in our space, they shut down within a year or 2 years,
Mm.
right? And when you're booking footwear so far out, it becomes really challenging to open somebody to know that they're going to
They're gonna
shut
be shutting
down,
down.
especially for the tiering and the stuff that we're trying to get.
Mhm.
It's so guarded that, basically a rep is going to bat for you essentially to get you this account.
Mhm.
And they don't want to go to bat because they look like complete assholes when accounts shut down in 12 months or 18
Mm.
months or 2 years, right? And boutiques and restaurants and bars. They're the two toughest
Hmm.
businesses to operate. And so, we see it all the time. Like people just don't make it.
Wow. Wow.
And
And
so
so, that presents quite a bit of a challenge, right? And so, when you have these accounts that you have, right? You had Clay, Creative Recreation, Pony, and ProKids. How's business going? What's like day to day looking like? How are you getting people in here?
it's funny. So I basically calculated that I had to sell $157 a day in
Hmm.
order to break even. And
Mhm.
mind you, like this is in the middle of the recession. I quit working nightlife. I'm on unemployment, right? This is when
Yeah.
the Obama Act, and there's that extra. They kept extending unemployment.
Mhm.
So for the first probably 12 to 18 months of the store, I'm on 350 a week unemployment, but
Oh,
working in
wow.
my own business 6 days a week.
Yeah.
My business partner Aaron's wife Kelly would work on Sundays just so I had a day off.
Yeah.
Luckily, we sucked and we didn't have people coming in. So if I'd gone out the night, I could sleep in the back kind of and watch the cameras and listen for the door buzz. But you know, I basically knew what I had to sell to break even.
Mhm.
And so when you're at that level, you got that hustler's mentality, right? So I launch an eBay store,
Mm.
right? And so I'm selling Clay and Creative Rec and all these brands on eBay because I'd had some experience when I had to liquidate all those contemporary clothes when I got
Yeah.
out of that business. So I kind of knew how it operated. And so we utilized eBay at the time to basically pick up a bunch of additional sales
Hmm.
as we're building. And that kind of allowed us to keep the business afloat. And
Mhm.
and when I say I started with 75,000, just so everyone knows, that is grossly undercapitalized.
What would you have
I mean,
preferred to have started with?
I guess now if you think about it, and that's a tough question to answer because I think it depends on the accounts you're
On
able
the
to open
Yeah,
with.
right.
Now we sell a lot of premium products, and so to open a store like ours now, I would say $1,000,000, maybe more,
Wow.
because obviously our builds are a little bit more extensive.
Mhm.
Because of the brands we're carrying and because of where we want to position ourselves,
Right.
and then the inventory is just more expensive because we're selling more expensive stuff at this point.
Mhm.
And it could be more, right? It
Hmm.
just depends. But, we're grossly undercapitalized. We're utilizing eBay. We're selling some stuff in store, doing everything we can. Lo and behold, a brand called Tom's comes around, right? And mind you, this is when nobody was doing the buy one give
Give one. No,
one.
this was
This
fresh on
was
the
they
market, and it
were
was a
they were the
thing.
first, right?
Yeah.
And so we get a Tom's account, and I am just cranking Toms on eBay, like selling 60, $70,000 a week, right?
What?
And it's amazing because now for the first time, I'm pulling I'm off unemployment. I'm taking 350 a week from the
Mhm.
store, right?
Mhm.
And 350 a week, guys, you can't really
I'm
not
just
much to live
Yeah,
off.
it's the minimum. Yeah, you
You're
scraping
scraping
by.
by, right? I replaced my unemployment, did that for like a year, and so Tom's explodes. We got an eBay business. I'm buying some off-price goods from other brands. We're maintaining some margins, and we're dumping everything back into the business.
Mhm.
Right? It allowed us to buy inventory and really stay afloat. And so the first time that I take a vacation, I go to India for my grandfather's 100th birthday.
Mhm.
So I fly to India and I land and get to Wi-Fi and I turn my phone on and I get an email. I get like 700 emails basically saying that all these Tom's eBay listings had been shut down
Ooh.
based on this Vero program, which is the Verified Rights Owner program. So eBay had set this program up when people were selling fakes
Mhm.
that, a company could come to them and say, "We're the verified rights owners of this product. We need to be able
We
to police what's happening to an
Oh my
extent."
goodness.
So at the time, a lot of brands were launching their own eBays, right? This is
Mhm.
before there was, I mean,
All the
eBay was
rules
the
and
at this
restrictions. Yeah,
time.
you could do
Amazon was
whatever.
whatever,
Right, right.
but eBay was the one, right?
Mhm.
For a third party selling channel. And so I get this email that all my listings are shut down. And I like instantly turn to my brother. I'm like, I got to go back.
Oh my
Like,
god.
I'm fucking going out of business.
Literally in the middle of your grandfather's
Like just
100th
landed
birthday.
first day in India tired. I'm like, I got to go. Like, I'm freaking out, And at the
Mm.
time, we didn't have a big team. Like, have this inventory now that I'm like, what am I going to
What am
do
I
with
do?
this?
Yeah.
Like, definitely not selling that much Toms through my store.
Yeah.
And I remember distinctly, my brother looks at me and says, "Man, sounds like you got bigger problems." I'm like, "What the could be a bigger problem than this?"
Right,
You know what
yeah.
I mean? Like, I'm going under.
Yeah.
And he's like, "No, your bigger problem is that one thing
Hmm.
can basically shut your business down.
Hmm.
And I hate to tell you this, you've built the wrong type of business, right?"
Hmm.
And that resonates with me to this day, right? You
Wow.
talk about vendors that people get dependent on, and there's this lore of footwear brand X, being able to shut people down because they decide to pull their account, or footwear B, it's 40% of their business, and
Yeah.
shit goes south. And so now, from that day forward, I realized in my head, like, I built something incorrectly, right?
Hmm.
Like, we can't be dependent on one thing, because if that
Yeah.
one thing, something could happen at any given
In
time,
time, you're out of business.
you are, and there's people working for you at this
Right.
point. Like, it's all these, it's just a shitty feeling,
Yeah.
and he was right. And
Hmm.
so, long and short of it, we weathered that storm, and we've had a couple, probably 3 or 4 different instances like that. And
Yeah.
the one thing I would say about being an entrepreneur is you have to get used to taking those crazy L's.
Hmm.
And the more you take them, the more you understand that, I don't have the luxury of beating around the bush, because was my call, my decision. It didn't work. I got to keep it pushing,
Yeah. I
right? Like, you
mean,
don't have the option
you
not
don't have the
to.
option to just be like, "Oh, I guess it didn't work." Right? Like, you're talking about real lives at stake.
Yeah, your livelihood, right? You're talking
Yeah.
about everything, and
Yeah.
fear of failure for me has always been a massive thing,
Mm.
right? But I think that once you start having those instances, those big monetary hits, those big things that shake your business up, you just become stronger, and you have
Yeah.
a better understanding of, like, this is going to happen
Mhm.
from time to time.
Yeah.
And I've built something that can weather it and keep moving, and you got to remember it,
Hmm.
and keep going.
My goodness.
So, weather the Tom storm, keep fighting to get brands. Eventually, we end up getting our first big footwear account is New Balance.
Mm.
And luckily at the time, for some reason, we end up getting New Balance, we end up getting Asics, and we end up getting Saucony, are kind
Mhm.
of like our 3 big footwear majors, as we would call them, right?
And this is like 2013, 14, 15?
Yeah,
Yeah.
probably right around there, 12,
Okay.
13, 14, right?
Okay.
And, for some reason, retro running just starts cracking.
Mhm.
Like, retro running had like a 2-year moment. Made in US New Balance was booming overseas. I mean, it was just the time. And we ended up having those 3 accounts, getting the top tier of those accounts, because we didn't have Nike, Jordan,
Mhm.
Vans, or Adidas,
Mm.
at the time, right?
Wow.
So we're basically, all of our focus is on those
On
brands.
retro,
And so we're
yeah.
able to climb the ladder with them rather quickly, because for a lot of other guys at the time, they're getting retro
They're getting the other
Jordans.
stuff. Right.
So New Balance is kind of like, all right, we're going to buy some. It's working
Mhm.
here and there. But my focus is on, the big
Nike,
money,
Jordan, Adidas,
right?
etcetera. Right.
Where the big money is Jeremy Scott, Adidas is
Mhm.
popping. Like,
Mhm.
that's just where the money was. And so we were able to climb the tier with those guys, and we basically, retro running cracks off. And
Yeah.
now we have this other perfect explosive moment where we're able to basically keep winning and growing the business, right?
Mm.
As retro running begins to die, at the time Adidas was on moratorium, Nike and Jordan,
And moratorium meaning they weren't opening anyone.
yeah, they were just having a moment, right? And with big footwear companies, when they're having a moment, they just freeze, right? They're
Gotcha.
like, reps, like, we don't need to open anybody. We're doing so much business.
Hmm.
There's no point in over distributing.
Mhm.
We can still handle the pairs to our existing partners. You know, they just
We're
basically
good.
freeze. Yeah, and it happens all the time, right? Like, and so at the time, Nike and Jordan, they're not really giving us the time of day. We had some moments where we were talking to reps, and then they went dead silent.
Hmm.
And so retro running starts slowing down, and Adidas literally lifted a moratorium for like a month. And we had been in talks with them, and we end up getting our account open. We're open for a couple months, and Kanye happens, right?
Hmm.
Like,
Completely changes the
first
landscape of the sneakers.
first thing he does is he wears a white Ultra Boost.
Right.
Like a technical running shoe that was never meant to be
Mm-mm.
lifestyle. And Kanye wears it at a concert, and people are like, "What is that knit
Mhm.
shoe? That looks awesome!" And it was a great shoe, right?
Right.
Like still think it's a great shoe. The
Right.
original Ultra Boost, I will still wear it. Like it's
Mhm.
an awesome shoe, and that happens, right?
Yeah.
And now the shift is away from retro running, and Adidas is on fire, right?
Mhm.
And being the hustler I am, I'm on B2B, finding thousands of pairs of Ultra Boosts, and I'm booking them ATS. They're not catching me do it. I'm buying, so we're getting all this inventory flowing in, and it's working, right? And
Mhm.
again, mind you, everything is going back into the business at this point,
Right.
right?
You're very focused on just continuing to build the brand, build the business, right?
Yeah, and you kind of had to be because we had no money, right? Like we started with no money, so there was no cash reserve. There was no way. Like if I had to acquire a brand or bring on a new brand, we had to fund it with the profits from whatever
From what
brand
you
was
just did.
exploding at
Yeah.
that time, right? And then mind you, at that point you're getting off other party sales channels because you don't want to risk your
Mhm.
accounts. At the time it's like, and I'm knocking Creative Rec and Clay and some of those brands, you don't care as much. But when you start getting the big guys, you're pulling off those other channels, because again, you just don't want to, it's not worth losing
It's
your
not
account.
right, right.
So now you're solely focused on what you're doing
Hmm.
yourself, which isn't a bad thing, but you don't have that cushion, right? Of maybe
Mhm.
I can sell some 20% off here
Mhm.
and,
And be able to cover. Right.
exactly. And so, everything's going back into the business. We're trying to get apparel at the time
Mhm.
because, again, there's this evolution in what we do where it's not just about sneakers. Now
Mm-mm.
it's like sneakers and apparel, like
Mhm.
streetwear gets booming. And then all these things are happening where it's like, you're buying sneakers and you're buying cool apparel at the same time.
Accessories, like the whole thing. It's becoming a full package now.
Yep. And so, mind you, as this is happening, we don't have any place for apparel. So I call it California Closets, right? Which is a national company. And I have them build me this nasty, obtrusive island in the middle of my store. Like when in hindsight, like this it was hideous, right? But it had some apparel racks and it had some place to stack some apparel and
Yeah.
it worked and it was cheap,
Mhm.
right? At the time. And so we get some apparel and I'm trying to go after bigger brands. I'm calling Margiela, I'm calling all these guys thinking like,
Wow.
oh, we're gonna get it. And they're of course telling me to off, right? Not returning my emails. But I finally call, CDG Play, right? Which is a
Mhm.
brand that obviously it's an awesome brand and they tell me no, right? In fact, James Whitner actually helped connect me with them. This is
Wow.
way back in the day when we were both, kind of getting our footing. And
Mhm.
so our friends from the foundation, actually Antoine, who I think James mentions a
Mhm.
bunch of times, he had actually put us in contact because at the time I had MCM and James had some stuff that I wanted. And so
Mhm.
we started helping each other a bit,
Yeah,
trying to get some
you find
contacts.
your allies and start to build your community and try to grow
Yeah,
because you're
because
all in different
yeah, we're
markets.
in different markets, so we're not worried about the
Mm-mm.
competition. Internet, don't even have a website, so there's just no competition
Yeah.
between the two of us at that time.
Mhm.
And so to this day, we remain really close friends, and chat all the time. But so we're helping each other, and so he sets me up with CDG Play, and they flat out tell me no, and so I ask them why, and they're like, "Well, your store is not really set up for apparel; it's
Hmm.
a shoe store, and then you've added this rack for apparel. Like that's not how we want our product displayed, right?"
Ah.
And so it's the first time that really resonates with me. Like, okay, well, somebody told me why, which
Mhm.
is awesome, right?
Right.
Because it's not
As
about the
opposed to just
no,
no. Yeah, I wanna know how to do better because 'cause I'm
right?
clearly invested in
And
this.
and that's one of the fallacies of this industry. I think is like people always tell you no, and they do one of two things: they just tell you no, and that's it. Or if they ask you why, they basically give you a reason that's so unattainable
Hmm.
that they're basically telling you nothing,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And it's not reality because you look at other accounts that brand X has that's sitting next to the brands you have, but they're telling you that you have to have Dior in order to get it. And you're like, look, dude, there's 30 accounts out of your 40 that don't have Dior.
Mhm.
So what am I missing?
Right,
Right.
right.
It's basically their way of telling you, like, off.
Mhm.
You're never getting it or whatever. Right.
Right.
But I love it when brands would tell me the why, because
Mm.
I'm the guy that's like, okay, cool, I'll go fix that.
Mm.
And then I'll come back. It's like, I don't know if you've seen that movie Good Will Hunting, when Matt
Yeah.
Damon says, "How do you like them apples?" with the
Yep,
number,
yep.
right? Like, and that's the moment where he's like, "All right, screw you, you Ivy
Yeah.
League guy."
I go do it.
Went and did it,
Mhm, mhm.
And so I'm that guy. Like, so they told me, so I went and we found a building, we remodeled the store, and we
Wow.
set it up to have apparel, and we set it up, way different, and it was better. And then I went back to see AG play and said,
Mhm.
"Here's the new images. Here's the new brand deck, right?"
Right.
And they said, "Yes."
Wow.
Right?
Wow.
And so at that moment, you start realizing, like, you know, always ask the why,
Hmm.
because no's aren't permanent.
No, of course not.
But a lot of times people think they are. You get discouraged. I remember there's
Yeah.
a 2-year stint in feature where I was burnt. We were getting a bunch of no's from brands. This is when Hood by Air and some of the guys were
Mhm.
popping. And you just get in a rut. And I was in a rut for like 2 years. And then, we'll get to this, but we had the opportunity to open at the Win.
Mm.
And that kind of reinvigorated our business
Yeah,
overall.
'cause it
But
changed perception. What did you do over those 2 years to stay inspired? Like, to stay in it? Because that's a grind. Then it starts to feel like a grind.
I think the reality is I didn't have another option,
Mm.
right? At that point, we had a bunch of staff. We had a little warehouse. Our online business was doing well. And it wasn't that I didn't enjoy what I was doing. I just wasn't aggressively going after a lot of the newer, hotter brands because I'd gotten 7 or 8
Knows,
no's.
yeah.
And, I just kind of got in a rut. So we still had a good brand list. We still had good footwear, but we weren't pushing that envelope. And in this business, the way it moves and how fast it moves, you don't have the luxury of missing 2 years
Opportunities.
because you're in a
Yeah,
rut.
you'll be
Because what
forgotten.
happens
Yeah.
is all those hot brands, you don't get them, they remain hot. They go on moratorium.
Mm.
We're not opening anybody, right? So
And
now
then
you've
you're
lost that
for
opportunity and you got to
multiple
wait for the
seasons.
next
Yeah.
wave of brands. And so that 2 years can be definitive in the sense that you may miss brands for 4 years because of that or forever
Wow.
long. And so now you just lost a moment
Hmm.
in time in an industry where it's constantly moving at the speed of light. I mean, I've never seen, even now, it's moving faster than ever.
Yeah, I mean, there's no way to keep up with everything that's happening right now. Like, it's insane. But, I think you all have done a good job of figuring out, like, your pacing and how you wanna, play in the industry and how you wanna keep up. I mean, you mentioned the location in the Win, which is, like, you have a store in the Win. Like, how does that come about?
So it was actually pretty interesting. So the Win was doing a big expansion. They had I think a Ferrari or Lamborghini dealership, which they got rid of, and they decided to add more retail. So the Win is one of the top performing retail per square foot in the country. It's like
Wow.
Madison Avenue. It's up there.
It's up there.
Rodeo numbers, like, it's insane, right?
Yeah.
And so they decided to add more retail. And at the time, we knew a bunch of people that worked in with Nightlife, and we had talked to them. And, these guys are VPs of Nightlife. They're really high up. And they're like, yeah, we kind of talk to the retail. They have these meetings internally about what's happening. And at the time, the answer was they only want external brands, right?
Hmm.
So if you think about Vegas holistically, Vegas is the entertainment capital of the world, but it's also, to me, like the import capital of the world, right? So if
Okay.
Cipriani's is amazing in New York, Vegas wants it.
Yeah.
If Gordon Ramsay's the hottest chef in the country, there's 4 Gordon Ramsay
Right,
restaurants here
right.
now,
Vegas
right?
is like, that's here.
If it's, yeah. So, I mean, any Scarpetta, like, anything that's awesome anywhere, they want to have it here because
Hmm.
this needs to be a destination for
Mhm.
that. And so when I heard, like, look, they're just bringing external brands, that's why, right? They want to bring in the best external sneaker shop in the world or whatever because they want that to draw people
Yes. To the Win.
to the Win,
Right.
right? And so we kind of deaded it. I was, obviously, like, whatever, it is what it is. About a year later, we get there's a Mace Rich. They own a bunch of shopping centers, and they actually flew us out to Scottsdale. They have a
Hmm.
big mall there, and they were courting us to open. And so we're on this scouting trip. They put us up in a nice hotel, and there's, the guys that own Toca Madera there. And the other guy in our group is a guy named Charlie.
Mm.
And so Charlie ends up being the head of North American retail for, I believe, Kering.
Okay.
So, and if you don't know Kering is like a bunch of luxury brands, right? They owned Puma at the time, but they also own, I think, Montblanc, Cartier. I mean, it's a big group. It's not as big as LVMH, but it's
but it's
plays
sizable.
plays in that same world, right?
Right.
So we end up kind of connecting with him and kind of shooting the with him and kind of build some good rapport, exchange numbers, and get back to Vegas. And through the grapevine, I heard that the Wynn was going to basically open a store called Sweet 160, which is another sneaker shop. And, not knocking Sweet 160 at all. But at that point, I'm like, so they're looking at someone local. I get kind of fired up because in my head, like, we're a good
This is my yard
store. Yeah. That I'm going to go after it. Right. Like, so I basically, don't know where to start. Right. So we reach out to Charlie and I'm like, hey man, do you know, like, this guy obviously knows every operator, right? From a real estate perspective. We reach out to Charlie and he's like, as a matter of fact, I do know somebody on that project. He's like, it's actually my old boss.
Wow.
And Kering is basically running that whole project and helping them with all the leasing. So he puts us in contact with a guy named Rich, right? So Rich is, at the time, they're like still planning and getting everything, and they've got some executed leases. So he lives in New York, but he's here every other week. So he's like, I'm going to be here this date. Come pick me up. We'll meet at the Wynn. We can talk about it. Take me to your store. So I take him to the store. And he's like, yeah, this is exactly what we want. Lo and behold, the Wynn wasn't opening a Sweet 160. They just wanted a sneaker concept so bad. And the VP at the Wynn knew Jeff, the owner of Sweet 160, and brought him on to consult because they were going to build their own, right?
They're going to build their own shop in there?
Yeah, they knew that category was, the category was massive and they were missing it. So they're like, if we can't get somebody, then we're going to do it, ourselves. Right? So we basically go back to Nike, and we finally had gotten Nike at this point, and we started having some conversations with them. And mind you, we get the Nike team to come out to take a look at the site. So we meet with Nike, and then the VP of the Wynn meets with the Nike, because if we don't work out, they're like trying to get a Nike account on their own, right? So they've already touched base and figured it out. And, luckily, we were able to, dot our I's and cross our T's, and we got the nod from most of our vendors. And, the concept of opening the Wynn, it's obviously extremely expensive to be there. It was never profitability. It was always elevation, right?
And when you say elevation, what do you mean? Like in the eyes of clients and customers,
clients, but also vendors. Okay. If you think about the Wynn, for those that aren't familiar, they have every point of luxury distribution there is. Rolex, Chanel, and not just, Rolex and Chanel and Hermes. They've got an 8,000 square foot 2-story Hermes, right? Yeah. Like, that's 3 doors down from our store. And so when you talk about elevation, it gave us the ability to basically elevate our brand by being adjacent to these other luxury retailers. And even though we had this awesome brand matrix at the time, we were still located in Chinatown. So for some of the emerging designers, the Tom Browns, the Raf Simons of the world, they were still a little bit weary of getting us open in Chinatown and Vegas.
Right.
The complex isn't sexy, it's just where we opened initially, and it worked.
And it works, right.
And so it really broke down a lot of those barriers for us. It gave us the opportunity to pick up and acquire a lot of the brands that we had been courting and talking to for a long time, but we're like on the 99-yard line. That was like the catalyst that kind of got us over the goal line, as they would say, right? And so Wynn opens in 18, obviously still there. And then from there, once we elevated, we were able to acquire a lot of brands. We're still focusing on our digital expansion, web, which is a big part of our business. And, for us, we think it's obviously, as we all know, it's like the wave of the future, right? People are going less and less to brick and mortar,
right?
More and more to like the ease of ordering online and getting deliveries. And so once we opened the Wynn, we kind of were thinking about other markets. And I was at an event in New York, and, at the time, Calabasas was obviously, Yeezy was doing stuff with Calabasas. Like, people were rapping about it. Like, Calabasas is having this moment. I meet a couple guys at this event that own a store called The Kingdom, and they're telling us that they have a store in Calabasas that's basically they sell Gucci, Saint Laurent, but it's
Hmm.
handbags and purses at the time. They've since expanded into apparel.
Right.
They just tell me about Calabasas, and I'd always thought like, well, there's no stores in Calabasas,
Huh.
right? And mind you, you know, all the major footwear brands at the time are really focused on LA and New York as
Right.
key
That's
cities.
the story. That's where all the events are happening.
All the
That's
marketing dollars, that's where,
absolutely.
the, you know, core sneaker consumer is, or the brunt of
Hmm.
them in their eyes,
Yeah.
right? And so it's everything is about the LA territory. If you want to open another store, it's got to be in LA.
Hmm.
Like that's what we're looking. That's where, corporate is saying that's where we want Paris to
Yeah.
focus.
But for you, how does that make sense?
So LA proper never really made sense to us because there was just a lot of distribution there for
Yeah.
everything, right? Like
A
you
lot of the
name
same.
yeah, like you name a brand and they've got 12 points of distribution. And granted the market can support it, but for me it was always like, why would I want to go, get in a sword fight with either friends that have stores there or guys that are like Barneys that are bigger than me?
Hmm.
It just never seemed like it made sense. So I, had this idea about Calabasas, and I was actually talking to our sales manager from Nike, Ruth, and she had mentioned Calabasas as well, and said that there's no one in the area. It might be a good area. So I go out there to check it out, and there's one complex where the Kingdom is, which is a Caruso property that is the best complex in the city, in
Hmm.
my opinion. And I started emailing them cold, and I'm not getting any responses.
Hmm.
Luckily, I call Rich, who did our deal at the
At the
Win,
win.
and again, this guy's super connected in real estate. I mean, his company, he owns his own company now, but they know everybody. He just calls the vice president at Crusoe, like, and in like 48 hours has information for me, and it's like this space is
Come on.
available. And mind you, it had taken like 3 months, trying to figure out, and I'm
Yeah.
frustrated at this point. I know that there's probably other accounts looking at the market,
Hmm.
and so finally, he actually ends up setting up and getting the deal done for us, which was
Hmm.
awesome. Had to go through a long, extensive approval process with the footwear guys. Ended up getting the approval. Opened up Calabasas in November of 19. Closed in March when
When COVID.
when this crazy thing called the pandemic hits for the
Yeah.
first time.
Yeah.
We shut our brand new store down that had been open for 4 months that we invested all
Wow.
this money in. It just shuts down. And as you guys know, California and New York were two of the hardest hit
Hit
areas.
very
So
hard. Hmm.
they didn't open nearly as fast as Vegas, but we obviously were shut down. We were getting some great traction. We were
Yeah.
excited. And then everything shuts down, right? The
Yeah.
world
Just
shuts
complete
down.
halt. Yeah.
And so in, true feature form, as that had happened, we just moved into like a 22,000 square foot DC. And that was, I think, in February. In Feb, we started moving in, and then COVID hit in March. And so now I'm sitting
Oh my
here
goodness.
like everyone else. I've got 3 stores at this point that are staffed, right?
Yeah.
And you got staff asking questions like, well, you laying us off? What are we doing?
Oh my goodness.
And so I meet with my business partner. I'm like, look, all right, it's March. How long can we keep
Hmm.
our staff moving? We just
Hmm.
moved into this big DC. We need a lot of help setting it up.
Right.
Mind you, our previous warehouse was 4,000 sure feet, right? So
Oh
this
my
is
gosh.
5 times the
Yeah. Yeah.
size,
You've
different
grown quite a bit.
animal.
Right.
I mean, this thing's huge, right? And so I have a conversation with my business partner, and I'm freaking out,
Hmm.
right? I think
Hmm.
everyone was freaking out.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
all my friends were freaking out that are in this industry. Everyone was
Like what's going on?
what do we do? Like,
Right.
is inventory coming? Are our
Yeah.
brands gonna extend terms, or like
Hmm.
what? Like everyone is, no
Freaking
one
out.
knows what's
Yeah.
happening,
Yeah.
right? Everyone's having meetings internally trying to understand the best course of action and the best path. So I'm meeting with my business partner. We're like, well, let's have a team meeting because this is,
Mm.
a real unique situation. You
Hmm.
have people are freaking out too, just from a health perspective,
Yeah.
right?
Absolutely. They don't even know if they want to show up to work.
Yeah, and this is early in COVID, right? So it's like there's a lot of unknowns on
Yeah.
all fronts.
Yeah.
So we decide that we can keep everyone employed until at least April 31st, right?
Hmm.
So it's like 2 months,
Hmm.
like that's we can commit that,
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
not knowing what's
What's
happening.
happening? Right.
So we have this big team meeting, and my business partner said it best: is like this isn't a one size. There's no one size fits all solution
No, because
for
no one knows.
for this scenario, right?
Hmm.
Because employee A might live with his grandparents. So his situation is employee different than employee B, who lives alone and doesn't care and isn't freaked out because he doesn't believe in viruses, whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
So we have this big team meeting and we say, look, man, there's no judgment. Anyone that, wants to quit or, we're fully supportive, know
Do
our
what you need to do.
feelings, do what you got to do. Anyone that wants to work, we're going to move you to HQ.
Hmm.
We're going to run 2 shifts, an 8 to 4, 4 to midnight. We're going to limit the amount of people around. Like, we're going to do all these things to try to get through this, right?
Yeah.
And so we had, 5 or 6 guys decided to leave and, we still talked to them. Some of them came back after things kind of subsided, but we moved everyone into the warehouse. And here we are building this warehouse, which was awesome because next thing you know, web explodes.
Online goes
Just
crazy.
Explodes. And online, it all has always been a key focus for us. So a lot of boutiques online is secondary to their brick and mortar. For us, online is as important, if not more important, because we think long-term future play.
That's where it's at.
Online is everything, right? And so our web really explodes, right? And thank God we had these 25 people from the stores working in the warehouse because we would have never been able
to fulfill the orders.
Yeah, we would have been up creek without a paddle.
I mean, what's so crazy about that period is like everyone thought that everything was just gonna stop, right? They thought people weren't gonna spend. They thought, this industry was gonna, they're like, oh, this is when sneakers are gonna slow down. But it actually sped up. Like people spent more money on sneakers.
Yeah, and I think that people were getting more money than they ever had due to extra funds coming in through unemployment. Then there was this contraction of inventory, right? So that would never sell before is all of a sudden selling out. You're it's like Christmas as a retailer because you're like, all this product that I have to buy, is working. You're like, this is amazing. And so web starts exploding. We have all the store staff that's there to help, thankfully, right? So we get the warehouse set up. We get through that big brunt, and then you get to this next place, which is like, okay, stores can reopen. Now you're understaffed at the stores. You're trying to figure it out, so
the COVID protocol procedures.
Yeah, how do you maintain, at the end of the day, we got to be open. We have a business to operate, but you also have to look out for your employees. How do we make sure that our employees are as safe as possible and as comfortable as possible?
Yeah.
Because the last thing you want to be is, one of those employers that everyone's talking about. Like, these guys don't give
a care. Yep.
Right.
Yep.
And genuinely, our team it's decently sized now, but I consider us to be pretty small in terms of we do care. We constantly as owners are having conversations around team benefits, launching 401k, doing things to give, health insurance, all those things. I think that's a big focal point for us. And so you're trying to navigate all these things. And even now, right? Now we have Delta coming back, mask mandates are back. It's navigating them again, right?
And you can never get comfortable with this particular scenario. I mean, even though with that though, you all are still, have a team approach to how you're handling this and pretty transparent with the team and staff. And even through this, you're still considering growth, right? Like you got some new opportunities on the horizon.
We do. I mean, I think that for us, I think that, I like retail. I like stores. I think they're great. And think there's a lot of opportunity still, especially in our space and especially on the West Coast. And so I think for us, although retail expansion is on our mind, it's definitely, we want to make the right decisions and we're very strategic in where we try to open. When you get to the space where we're in, there's 2 ways to kind of do it. You can, we sell some luxury product now, and we also sell, we sell an expansive assortment of product, right?
And you have your own label, right?
Yep. We have our own private label, which is big for us, and we're, growing. And so, when we think about where we're going to open, and we always have to be cognizant to this concept of, can the market support our full concept, right? And our full concept is selling our own product. It's selling the most coveted sneakers. It's selling luxury goods like Givenchy. It's selling product like Off-White and Palm Angels, but also brands like BBC and Ice Cream and Stussy, which are heritage brands that aren't crazy expensive, but have tight, limited distribution. And there's still demand for them. So that's how we have to evaluate markets
Mm,
when we're looking at things. And
mhm.
so, we're looking to expand slowly in the right way.
Yeah, yeah, totally. Um, well, as we think about, like, you've been in this business for years now, and you've transitioned from other industries and come from, thinking you're gonna work in finance. When you think over your career at this point, you think of what you and your partners have been able to build with Future, and you think of the storms that you've weathered and the ones you're gonna weather in the future. There's a lot of young people that are, interested in your line of work and, whatever they might be in Marquette, Michigan. What advice would you give them, as they start to think through their entrepreneurial lens of what they want to create?
So I think that, there's a couple things. One, ask the why
Hmm.
always, because the hope is that you're dealing with somebody that was either in your shoes or has seen it before or has lived some sort of experience that's similar,
Yeah.
that's willing to help you, because the why is help,
Mm,
right? At the end of the day, that why will give you the fuel to make a decision as to what you're going to change in
mm,
order to get that yes, or to grow your business or further your business along.
yeah.
Um, a couple other things that I think resonate with me a lot is, one is a saying, it's just no missed opportunities.
Hmm.
I think that, when we constantly say this to our team, because you get to a place sometimes where your perception of yourself or your business is X. And so you don't look at Y. And you have to look at Y, because Y might turn into something completely amazing and awesome. But if you have blinders on
You
because
never saw it.
you're thinking like, I'm going here,
Mm-hmm.
that can become a major issue. And
Mm-hmm.
so we consistently preach no missed opportunities. At a minimum, have the conversation. At a minimum, evaluate everything.
Mm,
It takes 5 minutes of your time. Don't instantly have those blinders on.
mm-hmm.
Um, I would say a key to success, and this is just another saying that I've heard that resonates me with, is the most successful people that you see. One of the biggest keys to their success is they're working when you're not.
Hmm.
And when you think about that, that's powerful. I'm not saying that you need to work 24 hours a day, right? But what I am saying is, if you think that you're going to run a successful business, especially in the beginning, working 40 hours and you're going to get a nice car, and, like, that's what I would call lightning in the bottle. And I'm sure it happens occasionally, but 99.9% of the time, that's not real. Like,
Mm,
I work 7 days a week and I still work 7 days a week in some way, shape, or form,
mm-hmm.
as does everyone I know that's successful in this industry. They're taking a call on a Sunday morning.
Yeah.
They're recording a podcast on a Saturday morning,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, that becomes extremely important to understand. And not necessarily, like, I always keep that in the back of my head, because you got to remember, like, it is hard work,
Mm-hmm.
and you will reap the benefits of that hard work. You just got to be willing to do it, you
Yeah,
know?
there's no and a lot of times there's no timeline on that, right? Just because you've been doing it for a certain amount of time doesn't mean you're like teed up to become like this, giant great brand or the number one retailer or what have you. Which is also, I think, important, goes back to your first one of why did you start in the first place? And you got to remember that because
Mhm.
that's what's going to carry you through.
And then I guess another big one for me is that business is always evolving,
Mm.
right? Like, especially this industry. I remember when we first started, it was all about just being a sneaker shop. Now I
Yeah.
feel like you got to be the whole kit and caboodle. You got to be a mini Barney's. You got to be a one stop shop for apparel, accessories, jewelry. We sell books, candles, fragrance, and it's all really cool product and it's very curated, but our business has evolved to that,
Mm,
right? Like, you're seeing that, web wasn't a big deal when I first started. People had it and they did okay, but think about the evolution of the digital experience,
yeah.
right, over the last 10 years. And so, again, it ties back into that whole concept of, you've got to be on top of your industry. You've got to make sure that you're staying on trends, you're understanding what's happening, but you don't have blinders on, right?
Mhm.
Because those blinders will kill you. There's definitely guys in our industry that have been surpassed by guys like us because they were stuck in this one way of doing business or this one perception of what they needed to be doing. And now all of a sudden you're seeing the James Whitners and the politics and the onenesses and the creams and all these guys, you know, they're different. Game has changed.
The game has changed and the game will always change, right?
constantly.
Um, what's your mom think?
I think, my mom's obviously super proud of what we've been able to build. You know, I think that she's instilled so much in me by seeing her fight and the way that she was able to scrap her way to where she is. She actually just retired. She lives in Vegas now.
Oh, man,
So
awesome.
it's been awesome that, she comes over, I have a newborn, so she gets to spend a lot of time with her and enjoy that. But I think that, watching my mom grow up is what really gave me this scrappiness and the ability to persevere. So, but overall, I think she's really proud of both me and my brother. So,